Aten, sun disk, was one of many symbols of the Egyptian solar cult, a powerful religion that once dominated the unrivaled pharaonic empire. Yet at one special moment in history, in the mid-14th century BC, it was this Aten that would be proclaimed the all-powerful, omnipresent creator god, the only god. The incredible richness of the spiritual life of pharaonic Egypt, the thousand faces of gods, ancient traditions and rituals were suddenly challenged by one man, a new pharaoh who after 2,000 years decided he wanted to start over. Amenhotep IV, better known as Akhenaten, certainly a controversial figure. Extraordinary, unheard of. During his turbulent reign, history accelerates as never before. Opinions on Akhenaten are extremely different today. For some, a visionary, a thinker filled with naive kindness. For others, a tyrant, an intolerant religious fanatic, a madman who appears at the peak of Egypt's power, ruthlessly destroying the achievements of his predecessors, almost leading to the collapse of the empire. Hello everyone, my name's Irena. Welcome to my channel Ancient Sites Girl. I invite you to a podcast about the history of ancient Egypt. Today I'll tell you about the cult of Aten, probably the oldest monotheistic religion in history, as we can call especially its final phase. Of course, Atenism is Akhenaten. However, his religion remains little known to the general public. What was it about? What were its dogmas? What did the cult of the living solar disk look like, and what does it have to do with the Bible? I'll try to answer these questions as usual by presenting you with ancient texts. The dispute about the ancient Egyptian monotheism has been going on for 200 years, since the beginning of Egyptology. Initially, the dominant view was the post-Enlightenment one, that the foundation of Egyptian religious doctrines was the belief in a supreme being, a monotheism, which only on the surface manifested itself as symbolic polytheism. Among early Egyptologists, such as the famous Jean-François Champollion, who was the first to read hieroglyphs, Emmanuel de Rouge or Auguste Mariette, the prevailing view was that Egyptian religion had a double phase, an intellectual priestly caste initiated into the original monotheistic nature of the cult, and folk religiosity, which as a result of vulgarization and misunderstanding of the original thought hidden under a complex symbolism, turned into idolatry and zoolatry, into polytheism. The view of Egyptian primeval monotheism, according to critics, was rather the result of European notion of religion, an erroneous assumption rooted in both Christian tradition and Freemasonry. But the same view of the ancient Egyptian religion was held even in pre-scientific times by European Neoplatonists, Gnostics and Hermetists, practicing alchemy, astrology and Kabbalah. Nevertheless, at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, predominated the idea of the representatives of the evolutionist trend in Egyptology, such as Gaston Maspero, assuming a development process, from primitive animism of local guardian spirits through polytheism to what they believed to be the most perfect form, monotheism. This theory explains the emergence of a monotheistic tendency during the New Kingdom. According to evolutionists, this happened through elimination, resembling natural selection. The fact is that the ancient, politically and partly culturally independent areas, later called nomes, had their own guardian deities, but the earliest of them were monotheistic in nature. More and more recent data obtained by archaeologists seem to confirm that the Egyptians from the earliest times worshipped universal creator gods. The concept of primordial monotheism has thus returned to Egyptology. The archaeological discoveries made at Amarna in the late 19th century by Alessandro Barsanti and Flinders Petrie rediscovered for the world a monotheistic episode in Egyptian history, the so-called Amarna period of the 14th century BC. Historians were fascinated by the discovery. The unique art and literature of Akhenaten's time focused on the mysterious solar disk, Aten. Who or what was this Aten? And how did it all begin? At the beginning of the 14th century BC, during the reign of Tutmos IV of the Aten dynasty, a new cult appears in the royal family, which seems to be a private cult of the Tutmosids. The pharaoh and his inner circle worship the solar disk and consider it an aspect and a kind of primordial, pure form of the sun god. Aten, the term commonly used by Egyptologists, is a strange deity. Although it relates to the Heliopolitan old cult of Ra-Horakhti, Aten has never been represented as any living being. He is universal, genderless, absent from mythological stories. The solar disk was particularly associated with the rising of the sun, which among others represented an ancient deity called Hore-Makhet, Horus in the horizon. In the time of Thutmose, for over 100 years, that's from the beginning of the 18th dynasty and the New Kingdom, the Egyptian pantheon was ruled undividedly by Amun-ra, the Theban creator god, the hidden ruler of the universe, who was associated rather with the wind than with the sun. Although the first of the Tutmosids, Ahmose, titularly associated him with the Ra, in order to make his patron the undisputed king of the gods. Thutmose IV, however, quite unexpectedly tried to restore the central role of the sun, largely contributing to the renaissance of the solar cult that prevailed in ancient Egypt during the Pyramid Age. But why? According to most scholars, the decisive factor was the succession of Thutmose IV, which must have been controversial in his time. He was one of numerous sons of Amenhotep II, and his mother, Tia, was probably one of many royal concubines. However, the ambitious Thutmose seized power after his father's death, probably as a result of a conspiracy, a palace coup. To legitimize his rule, he initiated a propaganda campaign, evidenced by the famous dream stele discovered by Giovanni Battista Caviglia during the first modern-era excavation of the Great Sphinx at Giza in 1818. The stele, placed between the paws of the statue, tells the story of a young stele prince Tutmos, who, while resting in the shadow of the Great Sphinx, supposedly experienced a revelation. In his dream, the Sphinx, during the 18th dynasty, he was considered to be a representation of the god Hore-Makhet himself, spoke to him. He promised the prince the throne if he would free him from the desert sands that had covered his body. Quote, "Behold, thou me, my son, Thutmose. I am thy father, Hore-Makhet Keperira Atum. I will give to thee my kingdom upon earth at the head of the living. Thou shalt wear the white crown and the red crown upon the throne of Geb, the hereditary prince. The food of the two lands shall be thine, the great tribute of all countries, the duration of a long period of years. My face is directed to you, my heart is to you. Thou shalt be to me the protector of my affairs, because I am ailing in all my limbs. The sands of the sanctuary upon which I am have reached me. Turn to me in order to do what I desire. Of course, Thutmose fulfilled the wish of his divine father, by whose will he then sat on the throne. It's worth mentioning that in Tutmose's times, the Sphinx was already an ancient, over 1,000-year-old monument to the past glory of the pyramid builders, the great pharaohs, sons of the sun. And the Sphinx origins probably were even older. It was most likely venerated by a totemic cult, already in pre-dynastic times, as a natural but unusually formed rock formation, which was probably given the shape we all know today by Khafre in the 4th dynasty. In the New Kingdom, however, it was closely associated with the solar cult in its ancient and pure form. In the Amarna times, not only did it not fall victim to religious vandalism, but it was considered an excellent point of reference. Akhenaten eagerly portrayed himself as a sphinx, Hore-Makhet, which was traditionally symbolized by the solar disk, Aten, who wasn't originally considered a separate deity at all, symbolized only the sun disk circling the heavens. He was a manifestation of the power and omnipresence of the sun god. His name Aten, Aton, Iten was most likely pronounced by the Egyptians Yati, as evidenced by analysis of Egyptian names of the Amarna period translated into Akkadian in diplomatic texts written in cuneiform, the so-called Amarna letters. After ruling for just only a few years, Tutmos IV died, and the further development of the cult was the long and peaceful reign of his son, Amenhotep III, one of the greatest pharaohs, under whose rule Egypt reached the peak of its power, and Amenhotep himself, being the most powerful ruler in the world, was titled the Aten for all countries. Amenhotep III becomes a passionate supporter of his father's neo-Heliopolitanism. He looks with admiration and longing at the great pyramids of the 4th dynasty, dreaming of the omnipotence and divine status enjoyed by Snefru and Khufu in the times of complete monarchical power, unfettered by countless dependencies, including above all, a mighty priestly caste exercising power over the hearts of the Egyptians of the New Kingdom, devoted worshippers of Amun-ra. Enjoying political and economic autonomy, Karnak was then the center of an extremely influential cult, both the official state cult and the popular folk religion of Amun, to whom the common Egyptians turned in their prayers as a benevolent, compassionate god, an omnipresent eternal creator, older than the creation itself which he had wrought. The hidden god was everywhere. Other gods were his aspects, and his cosmic body was the universe for the Egyptians, who saw in him the mysterious, unknown great god enigmatically mentioned already in the pyramid texts. So Amun was everything and was everywhere, and his priests were becoming more and more powerful thanks to the support of rulers such as Hatshepsut or Thutmose III, who, having difficulties with legitimizing their succession, sought support in Karnak, granting more and more concessions to the priests. Even the powerful Amenhotep III had to reckon with the priesthood of Amun and his oracle. Therefore, Amenhotep develops his own cult, dependent solely on him, the cult of the solar disk, with which he increasingly identifies publicly, calling himself the dazzling Aten. He also began to title himself Son of the Sun, like the rulers of the Old Kingdom, and like them, He erected many monuments. He was probably the greatest builder of the new kingdom. Among others, he expanded Karnak, in which he places images of Aten, and he erected the southern sanctuary, which is the Luxor temple. From the so-called Amenhotep of Amenhotep III, largest of all the funeral temples of Western Thebes, only gigantic statues remain, such as the so-called Colossi of Memnon. It was an extraordinary temple, oriented towards the east, with large unroofed spaces, the courts of the sun. The gigantic sanctuary, covering 350,000 square meters, was to be a harbinger of new times, in which the new solar theology would prevail. The famous palace of Amenhotep III in western Thebes, Malkata, was called the estate of dazzling Aten. Growing up in the palace, Amenhotep IV must have been greatly influenced by the new solar theology. Perhaps even then he developed an exaggerated fascination with the cult of the sun disk, a belief which his father never shared, that Aten was the one and only true god. The death of his powerful father allowed him to practice fanaticism without restraint, in which he was probably supported by a follower of Aten, Queen Tiye, who temporarily ruled the empire. According to others, Amenhotep IV was an unbeliever, who only reached for the cult of the sun disk as a political tool. He improvised while creating a flawed theology, essentially striving for an autocracy unknown since the times of Khufu, creating for this purpose an oppressive system behind the facade of an iconoclastic ideology. Already in the third year of Akhenaten's reign, the construction of the Sun Temple at Karnak began, slightly to the east of the sanctuary of Amun, beyond the jurisdiction of his priests. Statues of the king in a new style appeared in the temple. His bizarre, almost caricatured images contrast with those of his predecessors, even the highly stylized representations of his father, Amenhotep III. The temple was dedicated to Ra-Horakhte, but instead of the traditional images of the falcon-headed god with a solar disk on his head, he was shown as a solar disk, Aten. In addition, the numerous images of the ruler weren't accompanied by gods at all. The temple somewhat resembled the Old Kingdom sun temples. In the uncovered courtyard, the first primordial mound Benben was reconstructed, from the top of which, standing on a platform, the pharaoh personally held open-air services. From the earliest times, the Holy of Holies, the part of the sanctuary containing the cult statue, was protected by a roof, and the ceremonies inside were accompanied by semi-darkness. Amenhotep IV thus carried out a true architectural revolution. The roofless temples would become a symbol of Amarna religious architecture. Soon the new temple of Aten would become the only functioning temple of Karnak, as in the fourth year of his reign, Amenhotep dethroned the king of the gods, Amun-ra, and dissolved his priesthood. This was an incredibly radical step, but inevitable. The pharaoh had a completely new idea of how the new Egypt should function. The only thing that could stand in the way of his plans was the most powerful caste of priests of Amun, who, serving the most popular cult at that time, supervised the richest sanctuary in the capital and the entire country. The high priests of Karnak, who had enormous influence and represented the most distinguished Theban families, would obviously lead the resistance against the king's reforms. Interestingly, in the same year, Amenhotep officially introduced the informal modern Egyptian language into documents in place of the elegant but already dead classical language called today the Middle Egyptian. Of course, when Amun is no longer there, the pharaoh must change his name. Amenhotep means Amun is pleased. His new Norman personal name of the Egyptian king is effective for the Aten, sometimes translated as servant of the Aten. Akhenaten. The solar theology of light was to soon replace the more than 1,000-year-old religious tradition of Egypt. By the will of the king, Aten becomes the only element creating and maintaining the cosmos. According to the most influential, until the Amarna times, Heliopolitan theology, the self-created Atum rises among the endless dark waters of chaos Nun to create the world through the moisture and breath he released, to give birth to millions, starting from the Ennead, the first gods, who are emanations of the Creator and his many aspects. So the creation of the universe is the expansion of countless bars of the Creator. The expanding cosmos remains united in the great God, from whom, at the very beginning, beyond matter, light, and time, the divine cosmic law, Maat, was born, the source of ethics and justice. On the other hand, the naturalistic vision of Akhenaten is a cosmos devoid of transcendence, filled instead with the eternally reborn energy of light. Everything is the all-encompassing Aten, which doesn't need intermediaries, doesn't need the buzz of Shu, Tefnut, and the entire Ennead. There remains only the light, emitted by the solar disk, the impersonal demiurge, the one and eternal, and his earthly tool, the prophet and propagator of the new cosmic philosophy, the pharaoh, who is effective for the Aten. Around 1346 BC, in the 5th year of his reign, Akhenaton began building the central sanctuary of Aten, which was also his new capital. The pharaoh mystic thus fulfilled the will of the god, who showed him the place where the city was to be built. He describes it on one of the boundary stelae found in Amarna. No one of the nobility advised me to do this. No one of the people on the whole earth advised me to create Akhenaten in this distant place. It was my father who advised me to create it for him. It was me, the pharaoh, who found this place that was not the property of either god or goddess, had no ruler. I found this place abandoned. It was in the area of Amarna, approximately halfway between Memphis and the then capital, Thebes, on the eastern bank of the Nile, that Akhenaten, the horizon of Aten, was built. The boundary stele marked the area of the emerging Akhenaten, and it was to be a city unlike any other. Within the sanctuary of the one god, apart from the temples, there were to be royal residences. In fact, the entire city was considered a sacred space. The center of the new city was, of course, two temples of the sun, the Great Temple of Aten, Aten, and the so-called Small Temple. Monumental pylons led to vast courtyards. The main sanctuary was built at the eastern end of the temple. They didn't resemble the earlier Egyptian temples. They were walled but unroofed. Spacious courtyards equipped with hundreds of stone altars at which the courtiers living in Akhenaten had to personally jointly celebrate the daily morning services led by their pharaoh. These were probably several hours of ceremonies, the participants of which, wearing thick wigs and, fashionable during the 18th dynasty, large, heavy necklaces, were exposed to the heat of the Egyptian sun, whose rays digested the sacrificial food placed on the altars. Its scent hung in the air, mixed with the one of flowers and incense. Any inconvenience of attending the morning ceremony was ultimately worth it for the courtiers, who were handsomely rewarded for their loyalty to the king. The overseer of the great temple, Merera, recounted in his tomb. Words spoken by the king. May the superintendent of the House of the Gold Rings take the high priest of Aten in Akhenaten, Merera, and place the gold on his neck, to his head and around his feet, because he is obedient to the teachings of Pharaoh, life, prosperity and health to him. Having done everything that was said concerning these beautiful places made by Pharaoh in the house of the Benben, in the temple of Aten, for the Aten that is in Akhenaten. The servants of Aten were also called the few priests of the new cult headed by the high priest, but they were responsible only for the administration of the sanctuary, didn't celebrate the liturgy, but, like the others, prostrated themselves before the king who was making offerings in the temple. During the services, hymns to Aten were probably sung. The most famous complete text of the hymn comes from the Amarna tomb of the future pharaoh I, Tutankhamun's successor, from the time when he was still Akhenaten's courtier, royal scribe and, above all, military commander of the chariot division. Here's a fragment of this beautiful sacred literature from the 14th century BC. Thou appearest beautifully on the horizon of heaven, thou living Aten, the beginning of life, when thou art risen on the eastern horizon, thou hast filled every land with thy beauty. Thou art gracious, great, glistening, and high over every land. Thy rays encompass the lands to the limit of all that thou hast made. The countries of Syria and Nubia and the land of Egypt, thou settest every man in his place. Thou suppliest their necessities. Everyone has his food, and his time of life is reckoned. Their tongues are separate in speech, and their natures as well. Their skins are distinguished, as thou distinguishest the foreign peoples. All distant, foreign countries, thou makest their life, for thou hast set an isle in heaven, that it may descend for them and make waves upon the mountains, like the great green sea, to water their fields in their towns. How effective they are thy plans, O Lord of eternity! The Nile in heaven, it is for the foreign peoples. It was only a fragment of the great hymn to Aten. We'll return to it. There is only one copy of this text. We also know the so-called small hymns composed between the 5th and 9th year of Akhenaton's reign, that is, at a time when the pharaoh's vision of the new cult finally became clear. The hymns are an interpretation of his rational approach. They take up visible reality. Without the sun there is no life. At night the earth and all creatures seem to be dead, deprived of true life energy which returns with the first rays of the sun reaching the earth in the morning. Even though their source is very far away, somewhere in the center of the universe, which he, the eternal creator, Aten, fills with his light. Life sustaining it, fulfilling the needs of all beings, and returning so that they could praise him with thanksgiving. These are the actions of Aten, the one who gives the present. In contrast to the old Egyptian gods, the Atenists weren't interested in the past of their god, his genesis and how he accomplished the act of creation. They also didn't take up issues related to the future, divine intentions, promises of salvation. Aten was here and now, the only and present Lord of heaven and Lord of the earth. always sustaining his creation, contemplating it through his son Akhenaten, whom he shapes daily in his image, who is his voice on earth. In the great hymn we read, "You come to rest in the sunset of the west. The earth is in darkness, like the sleeping dead." Atenism, by considering night to be a dead time in which the world only waits for the return of the revitalizing rays of the sun, negated the 1,000-year-old religious tradition of Egypt, according to which it is at night that most happens. That's when a cosmic struggle of Ra takes place. Traveling in his solar bark, he fights in the afterlife with the demons of chaos, who want to prevent him from returning to the horizon. The stake is the survival of the created universe, bound together by a delicate, by no means permanent structure, protecting it from being swallowed by the chaos surrounding it, from being flooded by the endless dark waters of noon. This force which saved the universe, made it stable and balanced, was mad. Maintaining mad was therefore one of the duties of the pharaoh and the pious Egyptians, who performed their religious ceremonies for this purpose, thus giving the gods strength in their fight against evil. The daily deeds of people, doing good, also strengthened mad. In Akhenaton's new ideology, the idea of mad was preserved, but as an unchanging force. Only the king could interpret it. The new mad is Akhenaton's will. The dramatic aspect of the solar cycle also disappears. The sun appears in the morning almost mechanically, regardless of the efforts or neglect of people. Since there is no longer a night journey of the sun through the afterlife, the mechanism of restoring life to the dead also disappears. In the new system, there is no place for the judgment of Osiris and his kingdom of Duat as such. There is basically nothing except the presence of Aten. Atenism rejects the existence of hidden dimensions of the cosmos, such as the Duat, the land of the dead, so vividly described in earlier Osirian texts. In the Amarna vision of the cosmos, there is no room for the invisible space typical of Egyptian tradition in which souls move. The place of justification, of salvation, and then metamorphosis of the soul is therefore not the celestial body of Nut, a mysterious, watery, alternative world hidden among the stars, but a cemetery, a necropolis where the dead are to patiently await salvation. One of the first victims of Atenism is one of the most popular deities, the ancient Osiris. With the rejection of the Duat, Osiris was dethroned. Akhenaten feared his popularity, especially the latest concept of Osiris-Ra as the night sun traveling in a solar bark. It was therefore declared that the dead no longer became Osirises after death, thus sacred funeral books were of no use. Tombs were also to no longer fulfill their magical functions of facilitating the soul's metamorphosis. Although the method of burial seemed irrelevant in the light of the newly adopted dogmas, at Akhenaten, both the royal family and the Amarna elite built traditional, beautiful tombs for themselves, probably as a symbol of prestige. One of the Amarna boundary stelae quotes the king. "Let a tomb be made for me in the eastern mountain of Akhenaten. Let my burial be made in it, in the millions of jubilees which the Aten, my father, decreed for me. Let the burial for the great king's wife Nefertiti be made in it, in the millions of years which the Aten, my father, decreed for her. Let the burial of the king's daughter, Meritaten, be made in it, in these millions of years." Of course, the tombs differed from the traditional ones in that they were oriented east, not west as before, the direction in which the souls followed the dying, setting sun. From now on, any rebirth could only have to do with the returning sun in the east. But how, according to Akhenaten, was the transformation of the soul to take place? Unfortunately, he left us no clues. This, perhaps the most important issue for the Egyptians, was most likely not of interest to the Atenists, who focused on the present. However, some clues were found in the texts written in the Amarna tombs and cult chapels. Everything indicates that the souls of the dead were to awaken in their tombs early in the morning with the appearance of the first rays of the sun and become living Bas, that is, an aspect of the soul that's the carrier of the personality of the deceased. Ba was most often depicted as a bird with a human head. Eternal life or salvation of the soul, or justification as the Egyptians called it, could be obtained in the temple of Aten, where their Bas would benefit from morning offerings to the solar disk. In the Amarna tomb of the aforementioned high priests of Aten, Merera, there is a pleading text to the king. May he grant the receipt of loaves and drink offered in the temple of Aten, for the ka of the royal chancellor, beloved of his lord, great favorite of the lord of the two lands, Merera, justified. So, in fact, the dead had to wander the earth like ghosts in search of the nearest temple of Aten. The one who replaced the old judgment of Osiris, who was to judge the souls of the dead, was of course Akhenaten, who considered himself the embodiment of justice, Mat, as the beloved of Aten. He was to grant eternal life in his name to those who were obedient to his will. So it's better not to inquire how, but to submit to the will of the divine king, whose greatness is celebrated in the texts of the Amarna tombs in places where practical instructions concerning the survival of the soul in the afterlife would have been found in the past. In the tomb of Merera we read, Adoration of Aten when he rises on the eastern horizon of the sky. How beautiful is your dawning, O living Ra, you who gives life forever. You illuminate the two lands with your beauty. You have crossed the two lands with your disk. You transfer them to your beloved son. You order the lands to rejoice his heart and to satisfy his ka. He administers them for you with a loving heart. The land is subject to him, as it was subject to you. Enemies are in front of his majesty. Their chiefs are under his sandals. You cause that he reigns for a duration like you, being here with you eternally, seeing your rays every day. You grant him the said festivals and millions of years. All your places are under his eye, for your son, descended from your body, the Lord of the two land, Nefertiti, who gives life. Characteristic of Atenism seems to be the affirmation of wild nature as the body of Aten. The great hymn describes the moment of the appearance of the sun's rays in the morning. The entire land performs its work. All the flocks are content with their fodder. Trees and plants grow. Birds fly up to their nests, their wings extended in praise for your ka. All the kind prance on their feet. Everything which flies up and alights, they live when you rise for them. The fishes in the river leap before your face when your rays are inside the sea. The previous Egyptian worldview saw chaos in wild nature, and its taming, was seen as maintaining divine order. What, according to ancient Egyptians themselves, distinguished them from other nations, whom they called servants of chaos, was their striving for perfection through breaking away from what was primal and natural. In this way, they aimed for divinity, in which they imitated their rulers. Hence, the representations of figures in Egyptian art are extremely idealized, especially in the new kingdom of Tutmosids, when the striving for harmony, perfect proportions, and making the portrayed people more appealing are most visible. Amarna naturalism, however, broke with this tradition radically, gave up trying to hide human flaws, and even significantly emphasized them. The trademark of Amarna art is oversized heads, twisted figures, and bloated bellies. The somewhat grotesque figures were shown chaotically. The compositions of reliefs and paintings were somewhat disarrayed. This is another very important stage of Akhenaten's revolution, who imposed a new style starting with his own excessively stylized images. Although such a trend had already appeared in palace art during the time of Amenhotep III, it became the dominant style of the empire in the Amarna period. The countless and varied images of the gods were replaced by ubiquitous images of the ruler, often surrounded by his family. His great royal wife Nefertiti appears on reliefs equal to the divine ruler. Like a goddess, the traditional female aspect of the god in Egyptian spirituality. Her role in promoting and leading the new cult must have been enormous. Quote, "The foremost wife of the king, whom he loves, the mistress of the two lands, Nefer-Nefru-Aten, Nefertiti, living and young, forever and ever." However, the pharaoh remained at the center of Aten's religion, titled in hymns, "The living Aten, the great one who is in jubilee, master of all that the Aten encircles, master of heaven, master of the earth, master of the Aten in Akhenaten, and the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, the one living on Mad, lord of the two lands, Nefer-Keperu-Ra, Wa-en-Ra, son of Ra, living on Mad, master of regalia." Imposing reforms on the Egyptians that were so contrary to their values required even from the pharaoh an iron fist. He surrounded himself with soldiers and policemen. The largest barracks known to Egypt were built in Amarna. The apparatus of oppression was ready to react immediately to any signs of rebellion. The disobedient were eliminated or punished with hard labor in the quarries and gold mines. The oppressive and militaristic system allowed for further radicalization of the king, who in the 8th year of his reign banned the worship of all gods, except the solar disk, Aten. All local temples were closed, and a great iconoclastic campaign was launched, the destruction of images of deities and the removal of their names. Many magnificent pre-Amarna monuments were lost forever. However, those associated with the solar cult were spared, such as the magnificent monuments of Heliopolis, Giza, or the temples of Amenhotep III. Around 1343 BC, the use of the word gods, the plural form of god, was banned. Only the cult of Mad and the Heliopolitan Ra, who was considered a form of Aten, was allowed to continue. The pharaoh also recognized the sacred cult animal of Heliopolis, the black bull Mnevis, considered the incarnation of Atum-Ra and a kind of solar equivalent of the Memphite Apis. The bull remained in Heliopolis, but a new necropolis of sacred bulls began to be built in Akhenaten. Around the 9th year of his reign, all anthropomorphic images of the sun god disappeared. Only the sun disk was left. Even the theriomorphic images of Akhenaten, such as a sphinx, were considered inappropriate. He also changed the name of the only god, whose full title before the 9th year of his reign was Ra-Horati, who rejoices in the horizon in his name of Shu, who resides in the disk. Akhenaten decided that in the extended name of the one god, there was no room for references to earlier deities, in this case Ra-Horati and Shu, so he officially changed the name to Amun-ra, ruler of the two horizons, in his name of light, which comes from the Aten. Interestingly, both names were written in a cartouche, formerly reserved only for rulers. This record also doesn't end with the traditional symbol of Nedger, divinity, a seated bearded figure or a flag flying from a pole, as Aten isn't one of the gods, but is the only god. From then on, he could only be depicted as a solar disk, often adorned with an uraeus, emitting long rays ending in hands that touch and bring to life all creation. In the great hymn, the disk is called "You are beautiful and great, radiant you are, and raised high above every land." The living Aten sometimes offers the symbol of life, the Ankh, held in one or more of his many hands, but only to a member of the royal family. This is how Akhenaten, Nefertiti and their daughters were depicted, as well as Tutankhaten, better known as the later Tutankhamun, and his wife Ankhesenpaten, better known as the later Ankhesenamun. All the favors of the god Aten could be obtained only through the royal family. To other people, the distant and abstract god remained deaf. He couldn't therefore be a personal god worshipped in the privacy of the home, a god to whom prayers were directed. In Amarna, several figurines of divine intermediaries, the royal couple, once placed on home altars were discovered. However, they were few in number compared to the multitude of also discovered in Amarna small, often very tiny images of the old Egyptian gods, both hated by the palace Amun and other guardian deities. Maintaining the first monotheism was accompanied by the first systematic religious persecution in the history of Egypt. The pharaoh decided that since the sun was clearly visible in the sky, there was no need to create stone images of the god. He also ordered the destruction of existing cult statues associated more or less with the cult of Amun. Fortunately, the large construction projects in Amarna absorbed a significant part of the funds and resources, so the systematic destruction of older sanctuaries wasn't a priority. The construction of the new city claimed many victims. The remains from the discovered mass graves of workers, including children, indicate starvation and exhaustion from overwork. Akhenaten certainly wasn't one of the most popular rulers. Unlike those he probably took as role models, enjoying the unquestionable authority the pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom, the sons of the sun, who 1,000 years before him had carried out much more ambitious construction projects, while according to archaeologists providing their subjects with decent working conditions. Traditional panentheism, the belief in one great creator god with countless aspects and names, may have prepared the Egyptians for the doctrine of the one god. What certainly shocked them, besides terror and iconoclasm, was stripping the god of all mystery, taking away the tradition with which they identified so much, including public ceremonies, festivals, and processions. As we know from archaeological discoveries, the underground ancient Egyptian cult continued to flourish in the privacy of their homes, including in Amarna itself. They were also deprived of the particularly refined Egyptian morality and ethics that they drew from didactic mythological stories repeated for generations, and from cultivating in their lives attitudes consistent with math, order and balance. What could have been most painful was the lack of interest of the new religion in the afterlife, which, as we know, the Egyptians pondered constantly, and to a large extent, their entire civilization was built on funeral rites. This extremely rich 1,000-year legacy was ended almost overnight by Akhenaten and his subsequent, increasingly radical proclamations. In return, he gave them an unambiguous theological doctrine, a visible, impersonal solar disk, and above all, himself. The son of Aten, his only prophet. Rebellion seemed impossible. After all, the Egyptian religion and basically their entire culture had always focused on the king, the earthly representative of the unearthly divine. The Egyptians had no one to appeal to in defense of their rights, especially after the dissolution of the priesthood. They were left with only the all-powerful pharaoh and his loyal officials. Around the 12th year of his reign, Akhenaten's hard course eased somewhat, which was related to the political crisis caused by the ruler's neglect of the state's international affairs and the loss of Egypt's influence in Syro-Palestine. Concerned about the lack of a male heir, he had 6 daughters with Nefertiti. The ruler probably took his son-in-law, Smenkhkare, as his co-ruler. According to some researchers, however, it was the great royal wife, Nefertiti, who was to exercise actual power in his last years. In the face of uncertainty about the continuation of his legacy, Akhenaten himself seems to have lost faith in the future of Atenism. He died in the 17th year of his reign, and his co-regent died shortly after. After a brief reign of a mysterious female king, Neferuaten, perhaps the wife of Smenkhkare, Akhenaten's son-in-law, Tutankhaten, ascended the throne around 1332 BC. The living image of Aten ruled for the first 3 years from Akhenaten, a city that was being rapidly abandoned, probably as a result of an epidemic. The young pharaoh announced the end of religious reform, and the cults of the traditional gods were restored. The decade of state Atenism, the only legitimate religion in Egypt, has come to an end. Discovered in the early 20th century in Karnak, the so-called restoration stele of Tutankhamun describes the condition of the state he inherited from Akhenaten. The temples were desolated. Their holy places were on the verge of disintegration. They had become piles of rubble, overgrown with thistles. Their chapels were as if they had never been. Their temple precincts were trodden roads. The land was in grave ailment. The gods had turned their backs on this land. If one sent soldiers to Syria to extend the frontiers of Egypt, they had no success. If one appealed to a god for succor, he didn't come. If one besought a goddess, likewise, she came not. Their hearts had grown weak in their bodies, for they had destroyed what had been created. It turned out that the cult hadn't found its defenders and gradually, in a natural way, begun to fade away. In the 3rd year of his reign, Tutankhaten returned to the old capital, Thebes, as Tutankhamun. About 14 years after Akhenaten's death, after Tutankhamun and Horemheb ascended the throne, and immediately began to destroy all remnants of the religious reform. Horemheb, a transitional ruler between the Tutmosids and the Ramessids of the 19th dynasty, officially reigned from the death of Amenhotep III, and his predecessors as figures associated with Atenism were erased from the king lists. Their images and cartouches were systematically destroyed. Egypt returned to its traditions, but some of the innovations of the Amarna period remained in the Ramessid state, more than the new pharaohs would admit, among others, informal language in official documents and literature. Karnak didn't return to its former power until the end of the New Kingdom. As for balance, Horemheb and his successors tried to support cults other than Amun-ra. Moreover, in post-Amarna Egypt, the solar cult flourished again. The influence of the Amarna experiment seems to extend beyond the borders of Egypt. Astonishing and controversial is the similarity of the great hymn to Aten to the biblical Psalm 104 from the Book of Psalms, some 400 years younger. To compare both texts, I'll quote their fragments. Hymn. The entire land performs its work. All the flocks are content with their fodder. Trees and plants grow. Birds fly up to their nests. Psalm. They give water to all the beasts of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. The birds of the sky nest by the waters. Hymn. Every lion comes out of his cave, and all the serpents bite, for darkness is a blanket. Psalm. You bring darkness, it becomes night, and all the beasts of the forest prowl. The lions roar for their prey and seek their food from God. Hymn. The barges sail upstream and downstream too, for every way is open at your rising. The fishes in the river leap before your face when your rays are inside the sea. Psalm. There is the sea, vast and spacious, teeming with creatures beyond number, living things both large and small. There the ships go to and fro. Hymn. When you rise, they live. When you set, they die. Psalm. When you hide your face, they are terrified. When you take away their breath, they die and return to the dust. In the 1930s, an extremely controversial thesis was put forward by Sigmund Freud himself, a pioneer of modern psychology, trying to establish a collective psychoanalysis of the Jewish people. After 20 years of exploring the history of the ancient Hebrews, the answer he found was: Moses created the Jewish character. Freud postulated, however, that Moses was an Egyptian and a follower of Atenism, perhaps even a priest who organized the Exodus to save the religion from persecution. As you can see, alternative controversial theories about antiquity are nothing new. I hope you learned something new about the beliefs of ancient Egyptians. Thank you for listening. Please let me know in the comments what you'd like to hear about next time. I'd also like to thank all my patrons. I truly appreciate your contribution. Thank you so much. If you don't support me yet, but would like to, I placed my Patreon link below in the description. Don't forget to like my video and subscribe to my channel. Goodbye, and see you on the next one.